We don't have to avoid drawing scenes because they have a lot of trees or foliage in them. There is such wonderful contrast and accompaniment to architecture. We just need to learn to see them as a texture that we need to represent. We need to see them as an overall shape and surface, and forget that they're trees, forget that they're leaves, and draw the big picture, draw the overall effect, and not the exact detail. In this video, I talk you through it with this wonderful drawing of the rear of Notre Cathedral, where the trees, where the foliage is just as much an important part of the effect of the cathedral as everything else in the drawing. So, let's give it a go, eh? Because these are hedged trees, without the recognizable shape of a tree outline, it's a little bit harder, but we do have the contrast between how we draw these trees and the architecture to help show what they are. I draw a very light line to start with. Light both in the weight I apply to it, but also it's a very broken, jagged, dotted line. I reserve space for this lamp because it's going to be really important for the interest of this picture that this lamp stands out against the dark shadows behind it and the smaller lamp down to the side. Also, just make clear where this wall is going to come in because we want a good clean line separating the light and the smoothness of the wall with the foliage. Just plotting out now the architecture to make sure I reserve the spaces for it, and I also have a sense of scale with it because this all sits in the foreground compared to the foliage, so it will help me make the marks appropriate for the foliage to have this in some measure there at first. And so I'm now adding the line that's going to be sort of the top of the shade. Now in this wall of foliage closest to us, we've got shade where, if you like, the vertical wall is blocked from receiving the sun because of the position of the sun, but within that, and what I'm drawing now, we've got shadow. We've got places inside, if you like, the canopy where the other parts of the tree are also casting a shadow, and shadow is darker than shade, which is why these shadow areas are darker. And so I'm putting in a good number of the shadow areas before I start to do the shade. I do have a video on the difference between shade and shadow, which might be helpful to go and watch if you haven't seen it. And the other important thing to remember is foreshadowing. And so the blotches of shadow closest to us are going to be larger and wider than the ones that are further away down along the hedged trees, because foreshortening means that what we see is visually compressed the further away from us it goes. So again, I have numerous videos on foreshortening if you're interested in that. So now I start to add some hatching for the shade. I'm hatching more than I'm cross hatching because I like my hatching to reflect the shape and direction of what's underneath it, but I don't do it in straight lines. Although it's all roughly vertical, I do it in patches that I angle slightly, and that I think just helps give the roughly vertical but not exactly vertical wall of foliage which has been trimmed here. You'll notice here I'm actually doing my hatching from the line upwards because that's the easiest way to make sure I don't cross over the line of this awning. Again, because getting a nice smooth crisp contrast there is quite important to making the picture easy to read. And so now it's back and forth, and so my shadow blobs on the right hand side are lighter, narrower and smaller to hopefully give a sense of them being further away. Now I'm drawing the trees that sit behind the hedged trees, and again I'm doing a very light broken line to suggest the uneven and leafy structure of the top of these several trees. In many of my videos I often talk about lining what I'm drawing with what I've already drawn, and that's just as important with trees as it is with anything. And so I use the lamppost and the awning and the building on the right to help me line up where these trees meet and how far down different shadow elements come. Just as important to plot this as the architecture. A weakness of many drawings is that the trees are drawn much more carelessly and the rigor with which the architecture is often drawn. My process is the same here. I'm using a lighter pen though. I've got two grades of pen. I've switched to the micro to draw these further away trees because the lighter touch that the thinner line will give will create a sense of them being, I hope, slightly further away. I'm also trying to do lighter lines closer together to also give a sense of further away compared to the heavier lines in front. What I'm trying to do is to give the eye places to rest on these trees to get a sense of, oh, there's a bunch of leaves coming forward in the canopy here, or there's a bit of a hole in the canopy here, or dark because there are shadows within it being cast by the rest of the tree. So that's quite important. Again, I'm keeping my hatching fairly up and down because I do want it to relate somewhat to the marks I've used for the hedged trees in front. For this tree on the left hand side, I'm doing a much lighter touch. It's more in the sun than the others, and it is a different type of tree with a finer leaf. I'm keeping it quite feathery on the edges, and I'm even drawing a few branches very lightly towards the edges and even a few little branches sticking out of the canopy, just to give a sense that it's a different type of tree, and certainly that there's more light penetrating into it, so we don't get the same shadows that we get in the other tree. It really can't be rushed. So now it's time to draw Notre Dame Cathedral behind these trees. I deliberately drew the trees first so that I would put my energy and my focus on drawing them. The cathedral really needs to sit behind them. It's not that the trees are more important as a subject, but we want the sense that the foreground and the midground really is close to us, and then we have this enormous cathedral looming over the back of us. That's, if you like, the drama of this view of the cathedral. So I need to resist the urge to start drawing the detail in too much exactness. I really want to just be suggesting the shape of this cathedral. So I want to get the overall outlines correct, but I don't need to worry about the detail because the darker lines and the greater detail in the front will draw our attention. Keeping this light touch, really wanting an accurate outline of the cathedral, wanting the perspective lines and angles to look right so that nothing draws unnecessary attention. The real drama of this scene is from this sense that the cathedral is enormous behind these really large trees that are much closer. So we want to keep the cathedral pushed back because it will actually appear larger if it's further back from these trees. Really important to do that, and even with this spire, it's further back than the front part of the cathedral to us, and so an even lighter touch is necessary. And yet it's it was such a beautiful structure that I want to still keep some of the interest visible just by using the line and the shadow, but as I keep saying, with a light touch. And so I add the other details of little decorative pinnacles over here on the left. Very gestural with the shading here, and now some detail on this foreground building. With these lines, it's important to get the perspective right. As they go higher from eye level, the perspective angle slightly increases, and that's the sort of detail we need to make sure we capture. Doesn't have to be much, but it has to be a little bit. So now I'm doing the awning, and I start to do some of these street level details as well. They're really important. I'm going to simplify the scene underneath the cafe awning because otherwise it will be too cluttered and the edge of the image goes right through the middle of it. But these figures on the far side of the street, I'll certainly be including them because they're very important for giving a sense of scale, but also for bringing a conclusion to the trees and to their trunks, which we see through the rail behind them. So now I'm working in this railing behind, and again, it's a way of showing the street moving away from us, both the perspective of the top and bottom rails, but also the foreshortening of how far apart the vertical rails are. This enables me also to draw in the trunks of the trees, which helps make them look more definitely like trees. And I'm not really trying to draw any exactness of this section of what's in my reference photo. I just want to create something that looks real in my drawing, and nothing that will swamp the figures closer in the foreground. And then I'm really making lots of little adjustments, particularly with shade and just tightening up some of the areas where the shadow comes up against lighter surfaces. I realise I haven't put the south tower of Notre Dame in, so I spend a little bit of time doing that. Then it's working out what else needs to be done. I put these shadows of the apostles there. Decide to do a few more lines on the roof because it's looking a little bit bare as it is. And really, I'm looking more at my drawing now, thinking, how finished does it look? There's a point where you don't worry so much about what's in the reference photo, but what looks right, anything look underdone or not quite angled correctly, and can I fix that at all? So that's what I'm doing here. Just a little bit of shadow here against the wall of the ground floor, just to give it a sense of being grounded a little bit, and just a few more details on this building with the shadow. And there we have it. In this case, it may be a nicer drawing than photo. What do you think? G'day, I'm Travers. Possibly the most important thing with these non-architectural elements of our streetscapes is that we have to realise that when we draw them, we have to bring the same effort in terms of observation and drawing skill and care as we bring to our architecture. Otherwise, we're going to have some really nice architectural elements that are spoilt by trees and foliage that just don't measure up to what we've brought to the architecture. And yet there's such a wonderful contrast to the architecture. And if we limit ourselves to streetscapes and architecture without any foliage, then there's a lot of beautiful architecture that we're never going to get to draw. So we don't think of trees, we don't think of foliage as easier or harder than architecture. It's just different in many respects. And as I said, in drawing this, by drawing the foliage pretty much first, it helped me to focus and make it the main event in my attention and effort, rather than a quick afterthought when I'm now just trying to finish, because I think I've drawn all the important bits. So why not give it a go? Again, I'll post this photo on my community page, so if you want to go there and get a copy of it, you can have a go drawing Notre Dame looming over the trees behind her in those happy days before the fire took out the roof and the spire. And if you do draw it and want to post it on Instagram, then tag me so I can see your work. In the meantime, have fun whatever you draw. I'll see you next time. Bye.